my focus is on a couple of things. One is when you're looking at a space, how do you figure out what you can fit in it? Or if you haven't found a space yet, what should you be looking for? How do you compute how much space you should be looking for the kind of guest experience you're after? So that's kind of the main thing. There's a few other bits and pieces. I want to try to get to some things you should avoid doing. I've got some examples of what not to do. So if you walk away from this thinking, okay, I know what to look for, I know what to watch out for, we'll consider this a victory.
This episode made possible by Restaurant Systems Pro. With excitement, allow me to introduce to you today's guest, back on the show technically for a 7th time. Former professor at Cornell University in F&B optimization consultant, Stephani Robson. My lady, Stephani, are you feeling unstoppable today?
I am always unstoppable, Eric, when I'm talking to you.
Thank you so much. And I, like I said, this is your technical 7th time on the show. We had three-part series, two previous 3-part series. The first one was business planning, and the second one was engineering your back of house. So today, first of all, those workshops are some of the best, most impactful workshops I ever hosted here at Restaurant Unstoppable. If you haven't figured it out yet, we have brought workshops back. We are going back to trying to do a workshop every week, and I couldn't think of a better person to welcome back to the show to dive deep into a specialized area of knowledge, you and your world of F&B optimization. So I know this is going to be good. Before we dive into today's workshop, let's get that motivational, inspirational ball rolling with a success quarter mantra. What do you got for us?
Well, this one is actually may sound like it's more of an admonition, but it's just because you can doesn't mean you should. Because the theme here is there's lots of things you can do with design, but what you really want to get to is what you should do.
What are the things you see people that they can do that they shouldn't do? Give us an example.
Oh gosh, shove as many seats as humanly possible into their space. And we're going to talk about why that's a bad idea a little bit today. And then in our next workshop, we'll talk more about it. But just because you can put a lot of seats in doesn't mean you should do that. In fact, it can hurt you.
Right. And there's a whole bunch of different variables too. Like what type of concept? Are you fine dining? Then people are going to want us. They're going to expect a certain amount of privacy. Right. So like these are all variables you have to think of. So, real quick, before we dive into part 1 of our 3-part series, figuring out your space. That's what we're going to be covering today. Like really kind of paint the big picture of by the end of today's workshop, where our listeners going to be. What are they going to understand?
Well, there's a couple of things I want to get to today. And I know that I've got lots of stories to tell too, so hopefully I can stay on track. But my focus is on a couple of things. One is when you're looking at a space, how do you figure out what you can fit in it? Or if you haven't found a space yet, what should you be looking for? How do you compute how much space you should be looking for the kind of guest experience you're after? So that's kind of the main thing. There's a few other bits and pieces. I want to try to get to some things you should avoid doing. I've got some examples of what not to do. So if you walk away from this thinking, okay, I know what to look for, I know what to watch out for, we'll consider this a victory.
I love it. And why don't you give the listeners just a teaser? What are the part 2 and part 3 of this workshop going to cover?
Sure. Part 2, we're going to do a deep dive into seating. And you might think seating, I pick some chairs. But what I'm going to focus on is how many seats, where you put them, and what that means for your actual financial success. Because my area of expertise, my research is on seating behavior in restaurants. And if you have the wrong mix of seating and seating in the wrong place, you could actually be giving yourself a handicap as opposed to maximizing your revenue. So that's going to be number 2. And then number 3, we're going to look at the parts of design that people think of as aesthetics. I call them atmospherics, things like lighting and music and color and tabletop. And we're not going to do a deep dive into all of that because it would take forever, but I want to focus on the things that you should watch out for and the things that can make a real difference to you, where you should spend your money.
Yeah. And I know, and this is the stuff I get excited about. It's going to get a lot into the behavioral psychology of how to influence and nudge people without them knowing it. Not in a weird, bad way, but in like a suggestive, like making their experience better with the space.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's the beauty of restaurants and design is there's a lot we can do with the space. And a lot of people don't realize it. they design things they think are pretty, and they really could be designing something that's profitable.
All right. Well, let's pop off part one. Take it away.
All right. So I mentioned I want to focus on space, and I'm going to sort of talk you through both some examples, but also some calculations. I won't get too geeky on the calculations because I know it's really hard to listen to. But when you're first looking at your front of house space, you have to recognize you can't use it all because you've got other things that have to be in there, right? So let's say you have signed a lease or you have an existing space and you're trying to figure out how to make that front of house as effective as possible. Well, you're going to lose some of that space to things like doorways, fire exits. If you've got an upstairs or a basement space, you're going to lose some space to stairs and the space around stairs. So where I usually start when I'm planning a front of house is I look to see how much of that space I can actually use. And as a rule of thumb, usually it's like 80% of the space you're actually paying for in the front of house is actually useful to you.
And that's
So
just
once
from
you
all the
figured out how
things
much you got to work with, what was that?
that's just from all the things you mentioned that you lose, like doorways, and then you have to get
Yeah.
your architect involved. And there's like, the city or the state has their own like ordinance that you have to obey by.
They do. And typically the fire codes are not going to probably prevent you from putting in the seating that you want, but they may prevent you putting it where you want because you have to keep a space in front of all doors clear, obviously, in case people need to get out, that kind of thing. But we're going to lose a chunk of space just to area where there's nothing you can put there,
Yeah,
either by code or just it's not practical.
got it.
Okay. So once you figured out, okay, what space have I got to work with? The next question you have to ask yourself is, what kind of, I'm going to just move this out of the way for a second. Whoops. What kind of service are you offering? So if this is a QSR, right? People are coming in and they're getting in a line, they're going up to a counter and they're ordering food. That's a different kind of front of house layout, obviously, than if it's a sit down restaurant where you have a host that seats people. So what kind of service is it going to be? And what kind of seating are we talking about? Are you thinking tables and chairs? Are you thinking communal tables? And we can talk all day about whether that's a good idea or not. Are you having booths? Are you having high top tables or bar height tables? Those are all going to influence how much space you need. And then lastly, what are some of the other features you want to offer? So is there a host? And if so, do they have a tablet or do they need to be behind a podium? Do you have a bar? So with a bar, that's going to take up a chunk of space that obviously you're using to make money, but it's going to take space away from what you can use for seating.
Right.
And in terms of how much space a bar takes, a lot of people don't really think through. They just think, oh, yeah, I'm going to put a bar and that's fine. Generally, a bar is going to take somewhere around 8 feet deep and as long as you need it to be to provide the beverage program and the number of bartenders you think your concept needs. What I tell people is minimum, a bar is going to be 8 feet deep and 8 feet long. And that's going to be for one bartender doing a very sort of basic beverage program. But if you've got lots of beers on tap, or you're doing specialty cocktails, or you want to really showcase an enormous selection of bourbons or something like that, you're going to need more and more length to pull that off. But that depth of 8 feet is pretty standard for a back bar, space for the bartender to work, and then the front bar. If you're talking about an island bar, like floating in the middle of the space, like you might see at an Applebee's or something, that's 11 feet or more in width. So when you're looking at your space, how you think about what kind of bar you need is going to, again, cut into the space you have for seating.
Got it. And I want to point out there are some lovely visuals associated with today's workshop. So if you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, be sure to do that because this recording is there as well.
Great to let people know that there's some diagrams here with a bunch of dimensions on them. These dimensions are in feet and inches because I assume most people listening are in the United States. But if you want to speak metric, we can jump to it. One of the key things about planning that bar space, I will point out, there is a magic distance between the back bar and the bar equipment where the bartender's actually making drinks and putting them up for guests or for servers to pick up. And that magic distance is between 3 feet and 3'6". Do not violate the magic distance between those two. There is a very good, both ergonomic and practical reason why we keep that bar, sort of think of it as an aisle, why we keep it between 3 and 3'6". The more bartenders you have, the 3'6" number becomes important. If it's just one bartender, 3 feet is the number you want, but do not violate that number. If you're trying to shave inches, that's not the place to do it.
I mean, it seems pretty obvious that just certain people might not be able to work in the space. Is that one of the biggest challenges, or is there more of a less obvious challenge that we should be aware of?
Well, it's a great question because it really is about moving your feet. So if you think about a bartender, right, they're turning around and maybe they're getting a bottle off the back bar, or they're reaching into a refrigerator in the back bar. So they're pivoting their body around, reaching back or reaching down, and then they're pivoting around again to make the drink. And you want to make the drink in the view of the guest, right? That's the standard thing we do to have great service. If you have too much distance there, you're taking an extra step every time you have to reach back. And over the course of a shift, that really gets tiring on the part of the bartender. You've got enough to do when you're making drinks. You don't want to add extra work for them. If it's narrower than 3 feet, you
But
can't easily bend down and open a refrigerator, right? You have to step out of the way. And if you've got a bar back carrying bus tubs full of ice and they got a scooch behind you, scooch is a highly technical word, you need that space. So that's where those numbers come from. So we're talking about, looking at an existing space, how much of it are you going to lose, including how much are you going to lose to your bar? The bar itself, you might have some seating at your bar, or you may not. But that space the bar takes up is going to be additional space you lose for seating. Okay, so how much space have you got left? And then how many seats can you fit in that? And I'm going to show on my visual here, but I'll talk you through it. The amount of space you need per seat is going to vary a lot. It's going to vary depending on the style of service, right? You mentioned, Eric, at the beginning about, in fine dining, people expect to have a lot of space around them. They want both the privacy of not being jammed up against another table, but really they're paying for more space, right? You're charging a lot more for their meal experience, so you can afford to give them more space. And you might need more space on the tabletop because they might have more cutlery and more glassware, and you might have a centerpiece and the things that we wouldn't typically do in a casual or QSR kind of restaurant. So for fine dining, you might allow between 18, 20, as much as 25 square feet per seat to accommodate that bigger table and maybe a more comfortable chair. People are going to be sitting there longer because the meal experience is longer. Maybe there's arms on the chair. So all of that is going to actually take more space. So for fine dining, we might allocate, as I said, 18 or more square feet per seat. At the other end of the scale, if you're talking about a QSR, a quick restaurant where you grab something at a counter and you sit down and you eat it and you get out, it could be as tight as 10 square feet per person. If you've got people sitting along a drink rail in a window, 10 square feet per person is about right. Most sit-down restaurants sort of in the casual space, and I imagine many of your listeners are more interested in casual restaurants, I usually allocate about 14 or 15 square feet per seat. And that amount of space allows you to have a seat, a chair, or a bench, or whatever it is people are sitting on, a chunk of table, and a bit of circulation space, a little room around it for people to move. But that amount of space doesn't include a few things that are important in the restaurant, right? It doesn't include the host area. It doesn't include the restrooms. It doesn't include additional space for people to walk around if they have to go up and serve themselves. So generally, I like to allow that 15 square feet per seat for casual, and then I'm going to add something on top. I'm going to add another square feet per seat or square foot per seat for a host area. So not only do you have the host standing there, right, greeting guests and helping them get to their seats and making sure that the flow of the dining experience works, because your host is really important for that. Your host is actually timing what's going to happen in the kitchen, right? They don't want to seat a whole bunch of seats at once. You need space for that person to work, but also for the guests to sort of come up to a podium or a place where the host is going to greet them. And if you're in a market like mine, where it gets very cold, you're going to have people sort of clustering inside the doorway. They don't want to stand outside waiting for their chance to meet with the host. So I usually allow about a square foot per seat for just that function.
So if you have 50 seats in a restaurant, you're suggesting that you allocate 50 square feet just for queuing space.
Yeah, the host stand, if there's queuing space, maybe you have a seat where people can wait if they're not ready for their table. Generally, the larger the restaurant, the more space you need for that.
That's a
But it's a good point, because if your restaurant caters to larger groups, you may not be that big a restaurant, but you get a lot of parties of 4, 5, 6. You might want to scale this up. Whereas if you're a date place, you get a lot of couples, or it's a place where people just come in and they're by themselves. You probably don't use a host if it's that kind of a spot, but you never know. You can play with this number, but generally I allow 1 square foot per seat.
Got it. And we got some other notes down here. I don't want to.
Yeah. Restrooms. So we could talk all day about restrooms too. We could make this a 25-part series, but the restroom space you need, there are codes that are going to tell you. But just quick and dirty, I usually use 2 square feet per seat to figure out how much space I need to allocate to restrooms. And whether you go with individual restrooms with the sink in each stall, so it doesn't matter who's using it, everybody has their own sink, everyone has their own secure space, or if you're using a more traditional gendered restroom, either way, 2 square feet per seat is about right. If you're really small, you might have to use 3 square feet per seat, but this sort of gives you a rough allocation. And then I add a little bit more space on top to give people room for moving around, right? Yes, there's a little bit of circulation space tied into those square feet per seat numbers, but I also need just general moving around space, right? Because servers are going up and down aisles. And if it's a QSR, guests are standing in a queue at a counter so that they can order or pick up their food. If it's a QSR, I might even have more space allocated to queuing. And I've got some examples of good queuing practice in a second that I'll talk about with you. But here's just some overall numbers. Does this all make sense?
It does. I have some questions, but feel free to tell me if you're going to answer these questions.
Okay.
When you're going through the order of operation to figure out how many seats you work with, does it make sense to start with all, like, I think you kind of started with like what first, eliminate all the dead space, like doors opening, the areas you're not going to be able to use, host stand, bathroom. Is there like a rule of thumb to like get like a quick glance, like an idea of how many seats you can work with, or like when you're figuring it out, like should we go in that order of operation?
Well, it's a great question because it depends if you have a space yet or not.
Right.
So if I don't have a space yet, I'm going looking for space and I'm trying to figure out how much I need for my concept. I start with how many seats I think I need to make my math work for the restaurant to be financially viable, or for the concept that I want to have. And I say, okay, maybe I need 60 seats to make my math work. 60 seats times how many square feet per seat, depending on what kind of restaurant it is. And then I say, all right, that gives me a number. Now I need to add for host area and restrooms and bar. Okay, now I know what size of real estate to go looking for. So I start with the seating if I don't have a space yet.
Right. And I can't help but think, like, if you're at this point in the process, should you or should you not already be working with an architect?
Well, I might get myself in trouble here. You don't always have to have an architect. In fact, an architect is great to have if you are changing the space. In other words, if you are moving bathrooms around, or you're moving doorways around, or you're adding walls, you will need to have an architect. But if you're going into a space where you're not making many physical changes to the structure or moving a lot of things around, you may not need one. And architects are not the person you're going to use for your back of house. So if you're moving equipment around and stuff in the back of house, there's a different kind of professional you might want to bring in. But You don't
Maybe like
necessarily
a
need an
Stephani
architect.
Robson.
What's that?
Maybe like a Stephani Robson.
Oh, well, I was going to say someone who's probably going to sell you your equipment and help you do the layout. Someone like a Stephani Robson is great if you're a big operation. But for a small restaurant, you're much better off letting your kitchen equipment dealer help you with the back of house, because that's part of what they do. You just have to make sure that you're not buying equipment you don't need. But we talked about that in our other workshop that you might want to listen to.
We did. I believe they were in the ballpark of 820, episode 820, and then episode 850. So if you guys want to go search for those episodes.
What up, Unstoppable restaurant owners and operators? We have to interrupt today's video to let you know that Restaurant Unstoppable and Restaurant Systems Pro, we're taking our relationship to the next level. Beginning in July of 2024, Fred Langley, CEO of Restaurant Systems Pro, is making himself available once a week in Restaurant Unstoppable Network to answer all of your restaurant systems questions, whether it's the profit margins. He will look at your P&L. Bring your P&L. He will take a look at that. He will dissect it. He will help you find your profit, whether that be through budgeting, inventory management, costing recipe cards, labor, checklists, you name it. He is a master on restaurant systems, and he's making himself available to you. Fred Langley and Restaurant Systems Pro started as a consulting firm, and for over 16 years, they've been helping their clients increase their profit by 10% or more. What are you waiting for? Click the link below to join our Facebook group, Restaurant Unstoppable Network.
So yeah, I'm a fan of architects when you're moving things around, but you don't necessarily have to spend the money on an architect. Now, if anybody's listening and they're an architect, they're probably waving their hands in the air and freaking out. But when you're starting a restaurant, right, budgets are really tight. And so you want to spend your money in a smart way. Sometimes a professional architect is exactly the right ticket, but not necessarily.
Got it. Are we ready to move on to the second bullet we have here?
Yeah. I want to talk about then the sort of the process. You talked about the order of operations. I want to talk now about the order of the experience that your guests will have. And I want to talk about some of the best practices when you're planning these in terms of the front of house space. And I'll talk a little bit about some design tips as well. But the one I want to start with is the arrival, because even though many guests will have scoped you out on social media or looking at your website, if you're still using the web, everybody's using social media now to make their decisions of where to go to eat. But the actual arrival sequence when they arrive at your venue is really key, because most people don't want to have to think too hard, right? They want your design to tell them what to do and what to expect. And where you want to really spend your effort is making things as easy for your guest as possible. It doesn't mean it has to be bland or boring or have signage all over the place. And I'll show you an example of where that can be a total turnoff. But your arrival should be really clear. Where do you come into the restaurant, right? If you have a space that has more than one door in the front, either because you've got a fire exit or it's a large streetscape and you've got several doorways, you need to be really obvious. This is where you come in. And there should be, something out there to let people know a little bit about what your experience is. The old school way to do it was to post a menu outside. And if you're looking at the images in this, I've got an example of a French bistro, and it's got the menu outside, and it's got the doorway flanked by plants, and it looks very inviting and very traditional. But there's a reason that we design this way, is because it allows guests to get a feel for what they're going to experience when they get there, understand where they're supposed to go, and also make the decision about whether they want to dine with you before they set foot in the restaurant. There's this funny quirk about psychology, which is people will be very uncomfortable if they walk into a space and then decide it's not for them and leave again. There are a lot of people who will do it, but it's not a happy experience for anybody, not for the guests and certainly not for you.
Right.
So you want to actually make it so that when they set foot in your door, they've already decided, yeah, this is the right place for me. So a menu outside, or being able to look in and easily get a sense of what this restaurant's all about, what kind of people are in there, what kind of experience they might have, I think is crucial to designing that arrival space.
I love that.
And there's lots of things that people do to try to set the tone with their arrival space. One of them is, if let's say you have a big wine program, is to make your wine part of the design of the space, which you can do. You have to be careful because wine needs to be taken care of, and you can't have tons of sunlight shining on it or lots of vibration from trucks going by. The illustration I'm showing that goes along with this is showing a very high-end restaurant in New York City that the arrival is this long corridor flanked with their specialty wine. So you get a sense of, oh, they've got a deep cellar here. This is a place where I can actually get amazing wines. But they've made a mistake, I think, with this design is down the middle of this entryway is a water feature. They have this sort of little fountain. And I'm like, that's asking for someone to step in it or
Yeah,
slide.
that's smart.
But the arrival, again, you're setting the tone. You want people to understand who you are through the design of this sequence.
I can't help but think of your last tip about offering one, was it 1 square foot per seat? I wonder how many seats are in that restaurant where they can devote an entire hallway.
Well, it's
Square feet.
interesting because a lot of fine dining restaurants, especially in places like New York, are not at street level. They're up higher.
Right.
Just as an aside, putting a restaurant either above street level or underground is a high risk proposition. For most restaurants, I would not recommend it. If you were a destination fine dining restaurant with a famous chef, if this is a Thomas Keller restaurant, or this is a, Daniel Boulud or someone like that, people will go wherever floor they have to get to that restaurant. So in the case of the one that I'm showing here, this is on an upper floor, and the elevators are servicing a broader building. So to get from the elevators to where this restaurant is, they've got this long hallway. So that's how they went with this design. If you were at street level, you're right. You're not going to sacrifice this much square footage to this arrival sequence unless you absolutely had to, because every square foot that you have is costing you money. So it's got to be making you money.
Yeah, I mean, I had the founders of Ever After on the show in Chicago, and like their experience, it starts like you go through like it's almost like a maze that you walk through before you even get to the host stand, and that's all part of. But it's also, I think Ever is a multi Michelin star restaurant, like world's best lists, like that's the kind of stuff these restaurants do. They sacrifice that footprint for the experience.
Yeah, and they can, because what you're spending once you have the experience more than compensates for the space that they've lost to that arrival sequence.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different strategies you can use to create a sense of interest or intrigue as guests arrive. Again, if you're a destination restaurant, intrigue can be really good. But if you're a casual or a fast casual restaurant or a QSR, I don't think intrigue should be top of your list when you're planning, because you have to have volume to make your math work, but also you want guests to understand what you're offering. And so the design is a big part of telling the story and also informing people what to do. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in just a second. Actually, this is a perfect segue, because if I had to pick one thing about designing a front of house, it would be the word sightline. Having the right sight lines, in other words, what people can see at different stages of their experience, and not just your guests, but also your employees.
What do you want?
What?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say your employees, if they can't see what they need to do, they're going to be having a challenge doing it. And I'm going to show you an example in a minute of where bad sightlines or sight lines actually make it harder for guests to get service from their staff. And nobody's happy under that circumstance.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a manager I had, a mentor I had, and the biggest lesson he taught me is you're constantly reading a room. You have to be able to see the room and read the room, and vice versa. Like your guest has to be able to see you. Like, have you ever been at a restaurant and you're trying to get someone's attention and nobody can see you because you're tucked away?
Yeah, and a lot of designers, and I say designers with some caution, because there are lots of people who understand restaurants and are really good at creating fantastic restaurant spaces. And there are lots of professional designers who don't get it because they don't think of it from the perspective of the restaurant owner or the restaurant staff. And so you're right. If I can't see you, I can't serve you because I don't know where you are in your meal sequence.
Right.
And if I'm a guest arriving and I don't see a host stand, I don't know what to do. And that the first thing I feel is discomfort. You know, the first thing you want a guest to feel when they walk in is not discomfort. You want them to think, oh, this is a great, I'm so excited to be here. I can't wait for my experience, instead of what am I supposed to do now?
Right.
So that sight line from the arrival to whatever host stand you have, or if it's not a host stand, to where you want guests to approach so they can place an order, if it's a QSR. If you have a host, they need to be able to see the dining room, just as you say, because they need to know what's happening in each station so they can figure out where to seat a guest. I mentioned a minute ago that your host is actually a really important part of the flow of service. A lot of restaurant owners put the least experienced person on the door, which is silly, because that person is managing how slammed the kitchen's going to get. Right? They're also figuring out where to seat particular parties based on how busy a server is or how many people are in the party, trying to balance the dining room and also optimize the number of seats you have. When we talk about seating next time, I'll talk about this idea of seat utilization and how important it is. So your host needs to be very skilled and they need to see the space. And you might say, oh, well, they're going to use software, right? We're going to have table management software and they can just look on their tablet and see what's going on. I still think you need the visual, because tablets and software are only as good as what information goes into them. And you can't see the stress on a server's face on a tablet. You need to actually make eye contact.
Yeah. I mean, hosting has always been my favorite role in the restaurant industry, and it's because of all those reasons. You really can control, you can literally make or break the entire evening for all of your guests if you know what you're doing in that position.
Yeah. I mean, think about the old school restaurants that had a maitre d', right? The maitre d' was on the door and they were in charge. So those of you who are planning restaurants or running restaurants, your host is going to be key. Train them and make sure that they have the support they need to do this job right, which is to have good sight lines. I also like the guests to be able to look around and see the rest of the restaurant. You mentioned, Eric, a second ago, feeling tucked away. You know, there's a time when being tucked away can be good, right?
I was going to ask, because there is, like, you do want it to create space for private situations, right?
Yeah,
Would that be a room or a nook? But like, how do you find that balance?
Well, there's nooks and there's places where they can't be seen. And depending on who your actual target customer is, there was a great piece of the New York Times newspaper last week about an Italian restaurant in New York City where the producer of Saturday Night Live takes his guests every week. And they have a private dining room and he takes them there because it's discreet, right? He can have his famous people there. They won't be disturbed, but he also gets a chance to know what they're like so they can plan the show. But they still have glass doors so the servers can see what's going on in there. So they can certainly know when they're supposed to go in and whether it's to change out from one course to the next or top up the waters or whatever it might be. You still need a sight line, even if it's a private dining space.
Love it.
Okay. I'm going to continue on here and talk about this idea of flow of guests once they've arrived. If you're a QSR or a fast casual restaurant, and we could talk about what fast casual means. To me, essentially fast casual is still order at a counter, pay and sit down. There are people who will argue with me on that one. But if you have the kind of restaurant where you need people to come in, approach a counter, place an order, you need to give them visual cues of how they're supposed to do that, because usually that counter is towards the back of your space, right? It backs up on the kitchen, which is logical, right? You've got all that production space. So that counter is going to be somehow connected to your back of house. You've got to get guests deep into your space. So ways to do that, people like Chipotle have it figured out. What they do is they provide a low wall. It's usually somewhere around 38 to 42 inches high. And that low wall sort of separates an aisleway from the seating. And that low wall runs all the way to the back of the restaurant. So guests know where to stand in line, and then they can see the menu as they stand in line and decide what they're going to order, and then go through the ordering process, pay, and then go sit down or get their stuff and then go sit down.
Five Guys uses a wall of potatoes.
Yeah, Exactly. There's some really clever things, right? Walls of potatoes or sacks of materials that you're going to use in the back of house. It's a brilliant idea because now you save some storage space in the back of house,
Are there
right?
any legal issues associated with storing raw goods?
It depends on what the item is. In the case of potatoes, you're going to peel them.
Right.
And or they're going to be cooked above 140 degrees. So if anybody has fondled the potatoes prior to them being used, they're still going to be safe. But you wouldn't put produce out there that you weren't going to cook.
Right.
I think things like, you could put cases of ketchup out there. I wouldn't use it for alcohol storage. I think that's asking for trouble. But this idea of using the design to say, here's where you're supposed to go. And in the case of this low wall that Chipotle uses, not only does it tell people where to go, but it provides a support, an anchor for the seats on the other side. And we'll talk about anchoring and why it's so important next time. If you don't have the luxury of that wall because of the way your space is configured, or maybe you've got so much flow that you don't have any seating and you need to figure out a way to get people moving through your space. You don't want to make it feel like they're cows in a chute, but there's another trick of the trade, which is to use the floor finish to tell people what to do. I'm showing an example here of a restaurant called Indie Kitch, which is an Indian fast casual restaurant, and very popular. People stand in line for a long time to get really amazing Indian food. They have a menu along the wall instead of over where the food is being served. Their menu's on the wall because as you're standing in line, they want you to look at the menu and decide what you're going to have to move you through faster. So you're not standing looking at the menu and then looking down at the food and saying, well, maybe I'll have, what does that look like? They want you to move it. But they've used this sort of design on the floor to indicate here's where you line up. And it's amazing how influential something like a floor finish change can be. If you ever stop on a throughway, like a toll road, and there's those rest stops with restaurants in them, often you will see they use different colored tile of where they want you to walk versus where they want you to stand to place an order. It's a fascinating thing. If you sit there for a while and watch people move around, you'll see they'll stand at the edge of that aisle where the floor finish changes, decide where they're going to eat, and then they'll step over into the ordering space. It's quite funny.
I see a lot of those on my travels across the country, so I'm gonna have to look next time.
Yeah, yeah. And take pictures. I'm always taking pictures of people standing in places, ordering things. It looks weird, but I learn a lot just by watching people.
And that's why you're here.
I know, I'm a terrible geek. When we're talking about flow, we've been talking about the guest flow. I want to talk a little bit about service flow. There's a couple of other sort of magic numbers. I mentioned the magic number behind the bar, right? 3 feet to 3'6" is kind of do not violate that number. The next number I'm going to give you to not violate is what I call the 60-foot rule. If you speak metric, I'm going to call it the 20-meter rule, but we'll use feet here. The 60-foot rule says, do not have a seat for a guest that is more than 60 feet from the kitchen door. Now, lots of restaurants violate this rule. But, and I say rule only because it's a planning guideline, but it makes sense because the further it is from the kitchen door to that seat, the harder it is for your food to arrive at the temperature it should be, looking the way it should be, and also it's harder on your servers. Again, these people are working hard during their shifts. The further they have to travel, the harder their job is. So I try to design, if I'm asked to be involved in a project, I try to design it so that the maximum distance from the kitchen door to any one seat is 60 feet. And if I need to add a different seating area that's in a different direction in order to make that work, I do. You can't always do it, especially if you have a big patio, or if you've got a 2-level space and people are going up to a mezzanine or something, it gets a little tricky. But wherever you possibly can, try to stick to that 60-foot rule.
Yeah.
Okay. Couple of other numbers that are helpful. Service stations out in the dining room. So I'm talking about full service restaurants for now, and then I'm going to segue and talk a little bit about self-service restaurants where you can go and get your own condiments and your own stuff for your coffee. When I'm talking about a service station here, this is where servers are getting things to support the guest experience. And there's a number here that I use, which is the 20-foot rule. I try to make sure that there is always a service station within 20 feet of any seat. So if a guest drops a fork, or they need their water refilled, or they need to catch the attention of a server who's not on the floor but is at a server station, 20 feet is doable. And you'll see in the image that I'm sharing here is a service station that's glassed in. It looks kind of like an old phone booth in some ways, but there should, again, be a sight line from the service station to the tables so that the servers can see what their tables are doing, so they can time that, okay, people are finishing their apps, I need to go pick up their entrees, or gee, they need to be given more water, or they have that look that says, I'd like to pay and leave now, please. So I like this idea of having a service station that's glassed in, and also using space that is what I'll call residual space, little nooks and crannies that really don't serve any purpose, but you can use them to support service. So I'm showing an example here of a very narrow space at the end of a wall, sort of that separates a banquette from another part of the restaurant. And it's only about 6 inches deep, but it's a series of shelves, and you can put, glassware up there. You can have ice water resting there. You can have additional cutlery there. It's just an extra support for those seats. Again, thinking about how can I keep the servers from traveling too far? Because the faster they can get to what they need, the faster they can get it to the guests, the happier everybody's going to be. So I like these sort of residual spaces. And when I'm looking at a design, I'm always thinking, where can I sort of tuck in service spaces that are subtle, they're not obvious, but they also allow the servers to do what they need to do. So again, this idea of being able to look across a service station and see your tables. Often in traffic aisles, this is a great place to put a service station, because no guest wants to sit in a traffic aisle. We like to be sort of protected from the flow and the busyness. So use a service station to provide that separation between heavy traffic areas and where you have seating. Just makes sense. The service station itself, you have to decide what kind of service you're offering and what you need to have at a service station. Are you going to use it for a point of sale system, or are your servers using handhelds? Do you need to have water and ice at these stations, or is it just sort of cutlery and glassware and napkins so you can turn a table? Do you need a warmer at this station? Are you having warm bread? Or what sorts of things do you want to have at a service station? You need to decide before you design up the front of the house, because that's going to define the size of your service station.
Love it.
I know, very geeky, lots of detail.
Great stuff. We have a lot to cover, so I'm just letting you do your thing, sister.
That's fine. And I'm going to rely on you to keep an eye on the time, because I can just, I can drill down into all of these. When you're talking about self-service, I think there are many more errors made than with the service stations we use for our service staff. Because self-service, you have to remember, guests are not professionals. So they're going to be not necessarily skilled at being neat. They're going to make a mess. They are going to take more than they need of certain things. And again, they need to be shown what to do. And I don't mean that in a sort of maternal way. If the design can be very clear about, here's where you put garbage, or here's what you do with your tea bag. I'm a tea drinker, and it drives me crazy when I go to a restaurant or a self-service place and I get a cup of tea, and it's almost always a tea bag in a thing of hot water. And I like my tea to steep for a couple of minutes before I take the tea bag out. That's pretty normal. And so do I stand there at this counter for 2 minutes, sort of dipping my tea bag until it's the strength I want, and then I put it in the garbage? Then I'm tying up that counter for a whole bunch of people. So instead, what I do is I look for something I can take that I can put the tea bag in once it's finished, but then I'm not tying up this counter. So I usually take an extra lid, which means now I need more than one lid. In a perfect world, they'd have a whole bunch of those little condiment cups or something, which are cheaper than lids, that I can take to put my tea bag in. But things like where do you put garbage? And if that garbage is compost as opposed to recyclable, as opposed to just straight garbage, this is a real challenge for restaurateurs, because these days we want people to separate their waste, right? It's sensible, especially if we're going to compost waste, we're going to do recycling. And there's nothing more frustrating than wanting to do the right thing as a guest, and you're standing at one of these counters looking at a whole bunch of holes and not knowing what to put where. If you go to Panera, they've done, I think, a pretty good job of making it clear of what to put where, but that slows people down. So they're going to stand there and either figure it out and slowly put things where it belongs, or they're just going to say, oh, I couldn't be bothered, and throw everything in one hole, which negates the whole process. So if it's a well-designed space, it's away from where the condiments are, it's away from where the beverages are, it's much smarter. So having your waste drop at the same place where the condiments are may or may not be your best call. You certainly need a waste drop for little things, but for example, I'm showing a picture here of a Starbucks condiment table, and they have pretty big holes for waste. I would actually make them smaller here so that people aren't tempted to put their finished cup in here that we want them to recycle. Make these holes small so that all that will fit in there is a stir stick or the sugar packet that won't go, or after you've used it for your drink. So people aren't tempted to put something they should be recycling in these containers. There's something else about this counter that I like. If you look at the image, but I'll describe it for you, there is sort of a two-tier effect to this counter. So there's a raised shelf that has the different milks on it, as well as some promotional materials, because that's what Starbucks does, right? They promote materials everywhere in their restaurant. But they've got the milks up high, and then the sugars and the napkins and a few other things below that. And then there's a surface where you can put down your drink when you're going to add your condiments to it. So they're actually making space really useful by using that third dimension. A lot of people, when they look at a floor plan, they think about space only in 2D, right? You're looking down on it from above and you're drawing up, okay, here's where the service station is going to go, or here's where the condiment station is going to go. And they forget that, oh, I can put things above or below that surface. So don't forget that you've got that three-dimensional space to work with.
Great stuff.
All right. Let's talk a little bit more about bars. Because I talked about how big to make them, right? So quick review, 8 feet deep if it's a bar against a wall and as long as it needs to be. And if it's a floating bar, like an island bar, 11 feet, could be as wide as 13 feet, depending on what kind of back bar you have. But the issue is, where do you put it in the restaurant? Should it be close to the front door to serve as waiting space? So we talked about the host area, and you might think, well, I don't want to allocate all that space for people to wait for a table. That space isn't making me any money. I would rather have people go to the bar waiting for their seat, and then I can generate some revenue and they have a nice experience while they have a drink, and then we can move them on to their table. That's perfectly reasonable. That means your bar needs to be near the front door for obvious reasons. Otherwise, you might say, no, I want my bar to be at the back because I want people to sit at the bar and have food, and it's easier to support that from the kitchen. And I'm going to put that bar towards the rear of the restaurant. There's no one right way to do it. You have to decide what you want that bar to do for you. So I'm showing two images here. One is of Union Square Cafe in New York City, where the bar is both a place to dine, but also is an important part of the waiting process, because this is a restaurant that's very popular. They turn their tables a lot, but invariably there'll be a lag between when a guest arrives for their reservation and when they're actually seated. So the bar they have here is that sort of intermediate experience, as well as a place you could just sit at the bar and eat if you prefer. So it's towards the front door. And they've done a really nice trick with their floor finish, which right where you sit at the bar is one color floor. It's a tile floor. And then where you stand or where traffic is going to be is a wood floor. So they're saying this is bar area. This is not bar area.
I saw that. I was wondering.
You see, already you're getting an eye for it. And where they've put the bar in this restaurant, the kitchen in this restaurant is not at the back. It's along the side. So they've divided their space up into strips. So the seating is along the exterior wall. This restaurant's on a corner, so you've got seating along the long wall and where the corner sort of facing the main road is, and then their kitchen runs parallel to that. So the bar backs up to the kitchen, and so does the dining space. So they've done a nice job of kind of splitting this up. They also have seating on another level in this restaurant. And so there's a set of stairs for the guests. There's also an elevator. They've had to for code purposes. If you have dining space that is on a different level and offers a different experience, you have to make all those seats ADA accessible. In other words, you'll need an elevator. So if you have a private dining room on another level, or you have a bar on another level, or you have a different kind of menu on another level, you have to have an elevator. Those are really expensive.
Oh,
And they take, at least I would say 70 to 80 square feet on each level just for the elevator cab. And then you've got space around it as well. So try not to design in the kind of problem where you say, oh, I'm going to put private dining upstairs, or I'm going to have a wine room upstairs, and that's where we'll do our tastings. Now you need an elevator.
yeah. What is this rule of thumb that I've heard multiple times, that you always want to put the bar to the right of the entrance?
I have never heard that.
Ever heard that?
No.
Maybe it was in the book Barman, Joe Bastianich's book. I think I heard it referenced once, or maybe it was John Taffer's book or something. But like this idea that like you want to put, like, people have a tendency to gravitate towards the right when they walk into a space, and that they will want to go to if you have a bar that's on the right of the entrance, you will do more alcohol sales or something like that, or just
Well, it is true that people do move to the right in the United States. If you go to the United Kingdom, Britain, they go to the left.
Okay. I'm
Um,
curious about that. I always wondered how true that was, or how much that really played an impact, or made an impact on the bottom line.
Well, that's a good question. I have not done that research, and boy, would that be fun. So if anybody's listening, and if you have more than one restaurant, and the restaurants are the same in all other respects, this is the hard part about doing this research, right? Is it's one thing to say, oh, we'll make more money off the bar if we put it on the right, but you've got to be able to compare it exactly to a bar that's on the left in order to make that claim.
And if there's a huge space between the bar and the kitchen, is it worth the headache to have the bar on the right? Like,
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's probably not fair or not safe to say always put the bar in position X. It depends on the space you're working with. But I always start with, what do I want this bar to do for me? How many bartenders do I need to have working at it to provide the level of service I need for both the beverage program I'm proposing and the number of seats that I'm supporting? And then, okay, what kind of back of house space do I have? And how much access to the back of house does this bar need to have? Is this bar generating all the beverages for the entire restaurant, or do I have a service bar in the back of house that's doing cocktails for the dining room? So these are all questions that are going to be floating in your head as you're figuring out, where does this bar need to go? And when we're talking about the arrival sequence, if the bar is a big part of your guest experience, it's kind of a scene, you want that bar to be very visual, right? When it's seen from the outside of the restaurant, people look in and go, oh man, the bar scene's really good. So that tells me that bar needs to be up front.
right.
But again, it's all contextual. My students laughed at me a lot. In fact, they even made me a mug that says, it depends, because I always said, it depends about everything. And bar placement is like that. It depends on what you want it to do for you.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing I've learned for certain, in this journey to learn all that's true about the restaurant industry, the one thing I've landed on is that it all depends. It's such a complex industry. There is no one way to do anything. There's so many variables that play a role in the end product.
You're exactly right. And so when I talk 60-foot rule or the 20-foot rule, I use rule with air quotes, because, sometimes you just can't make that work. And if you're bending yourself into a pretzel to make that work and compromising in other ways, it's probably not a great use of your skull sweat.
Yeah, it's a balancing act.
It's an art, right?
Yeah.
This is an art. And we're safe from AI designing any of any human elements in it. We're not at the stage yet where I'm worried about AI designing restaurants.
Be careful. I have AI recording this conversation right now. And just when you said that, you paused out. So I think you might have.
And funny, my car just drove away by itself. I don't know what happened there. So.
What up, unstoppable restaurant owners and operators? We have to interrupt today's video to let you know that Restaurant Unstoppable and Restaurant Systems Pro, we're taking our relationship to the next level. Beginning in July of 2024, Fred Langley, CEO of Restaurant Systems Pro, is making himself available once a week in Restaurant Unstoppable Network to answer all of your restaurant systems questions, whether it's the profit margins. He will look at your P&L. Bring your P&L. He will take a look at that. He will dissect it. He will help you find your profit, whether that be through budgeting, inventory management, costing recipe cards, labor, checklists, you name it. He is a master of restaurant systems, and he's making himself available to you. Fred Langley and Restaurant Systems Pro started as a consulting firm, and for over 16 years, they've been helping their clients increase their profit by 10% or more. What are you waiting for? Click the link below to join our Facebook group, Restaurant Unstoppable Network.
One thing, though, that there is kind of a guideline of where it should be is where you have support for takeout. So a lot of restaurants are relying very heavily, obviously, on takeout and delivery. And where you put that station where people are going to pick up, whether it's a third-party delivery driver or guests themselves, they've ordered something online or through an app and now they're going to pick it up. There is definitely a right place to put this. And the image I'm showing here is of Dig In New York City, one of the many units of Dig In. And in this particular unit, I think they've done it exactly right. They have an open shelving unit, which is at the end of and perpendicular to the service line. So when you've got guests who are going down the service line, you know, placing their order, choosing what they want, paying for it, going to sit down, that's happening along the service counter. And then perpendicular to that at the end is where people who are putting together orders taken online or from an app can do the same process, right? They're still going down that service line, but then they can just put the bag up on this counter for pickup.
Yeah.
This to me works really well.
This is a post 2020 like phenomena. Like this became standard in QSR, fast casual concepts. You see it everywhere.
Yeah, and with good reason. Now, you might have a restaurant that was designed pre-pandemic, and you're like, okay, well, we put stuff on the end of the bar and people can pick it up, or we use a shelving unit close to the doorway. I try not to put things right by the doorway. I like to bring them in a little bit, like a counter or a shelving unit for picking up takeout. I like to draw the guest into the space a little bit, partially because it frees up the doorway. But it also makes them see what the rest of the space looks like. And so maybe next time they'll dine with us in space. So I like to bring them in. Another reason to do that, I hate to say it, but you want to keep an eye on the orders that are put up to see what gets taken and by whom.
Right.
If you have something right by a doorway and it's not easily monitored, it's not hard for someone to just stick their head in and grab a bag and run out again, and it may not be their bag.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing that is happening.
Yeah. And some restaurants don't want delivery drivers to come into the front of house space. They want them to come to a back door or something, either because they're coming with a car or they have an electric bike and they don't want to, have them going in and out of the front door. If you have that situation where you do not want third-party delivery drivers coming into your front of house, it makes it much harder. You can do it, but you have to plan your back of house accordingly. And that means you have to have a separate entrance, and that takes more space away from generating revenue.
Right.
So, you have to decide for yourself what makes sense for the concept that you have.
Have we reached this part of the conversation that I'm really excited about, the biggest mistakes?
Yeah, let's look at some mistakes. The biggest mistake to me is confusing your guest so they don't know what they're supposed to do. So when I talked about, guest flow, or I talked about arrival, right? You want people to be able to understand the space. A lot of restaurants design for the convenience of the staff and the service and not for what the guest is going through. And I'm showing two examples here. I'm picking on some local restaurants where I live. I'm not going to name them, but if you are, for some reason, seeing these images and you are from Ithaca, New York, you'll know exactly which these restaurants are. But they're restaurants that are very popular, but they have a huge number of items that they offer. They have specialty coffees, and they have baked goods, and they have sandwiches, and they do large format catering. And at night they do beer and wine, and it's just a constant flow of different kinds of products. And they have everything up on their menus above the service counter. So when you have that many products and service counters that don't swap out, that in the evening it becomes a bar. They have a bar over here, and they've got a bagel station over there, and they've got a sandwich station over there. It becomes really challenging for guests to figure out where to go and what to do. And one of the other challenges is, if you have a chain, if you have multiple units of a concept, make your flow the same in each one. Because guests think, oh, I'm going to a blank, I'm going to a Chipotle, or I'm going to a Starbucks, or I'm going to whatever. This is how these places work. And if it's different at each unit, which in the images I'm showing, these are 2 units of the same concept, the order process is completely different depending on which one you go to, because the spaces are designed differently, because the people who run these restaurants have chosen real estate that is hard to set up the same way. And they're like, oh, well, we'll make it work. All you've done is confuse your guests. So when they walk in, they're like, well, the other place, I ordered my sandwich and my bagel in the same place. Now I have to order my sandwich over here, but my bagel over there, and my coffee comes from a third place, but I pay over here. And it just ends up being a nightmare. If you have to put a big sign that says order here, your design is flawed. Generally, the more signage you have, the worse your design is, because what's happening is you're having to use signage to tell people what to do, and people don't read signs.
Right.
We know this.
And I think we're going to get a lot into this in the part 3 of the series, a little foreshadowing. This is where we use like the space to influence people's behavior. This is where you go. This is where you flow. Some of that came out today already, but I'm looking forward to that third part for sure.
Well, it all kind of stitches together, right?
Yeah.
And there are signs you need and signs you can do a great job with. But the minute you have to tell people with signs what to do, you need to rethink how you set up your space. Let me show you another common mistake, or talk about a common mistake, is forgetting that guests have stuff. So even if you're targeting, let's say, college students, right? I'm in a college town. A lot of the restaurants here target college students. Well, college students don't go anywhere without a backpack, right? They always have a backpack with them. If you're targeting guests that might be near a transportation hub, maybe you've got a restaurant that's across from a bus station or a train station, or you're in an airport, guests are going to have suitcases. And nothing drives me more crazy. I go to a lot of airports as I'm flying around doing projects. And sometimes I'll go into an airport restaurant and I'll be like, they have laid this out the way you would lay out any restaurant, which is dumb, because I've got this rollerboard that now I have to figure out where I'm going to put it, so it's not in the way of the server, it's not in the way of other guests, it's not in my way, and they don't think about it. This is especially true when you have a chain restaurant that puts one of its units in an airport, and they're like, well, this is how we do it in the chain, and therefore this is how we're going to lay it out. And I'm thinking, no, you've got a family of 4 sitting at a 4-top, and they all have rollerboards, and they all have a backpack, and they all have travel pillows. Like, where's that stuff going to go?
Right.
All right. Strollers is another one. If you are targeting families, they're going to have strollers. They might have multiple strollers. So where are those going to live? It's interesting, Eric. In Europe, I didn't know this, but it surprised me. It is not uncommon to park your stroller outside on the street.
Really?
Yeah. And you just carry your baby into the restaurant, and you have your experience, and your stroller just sits outside. And you'll see a whole bunch of them stacked in front of restaurants. They're perfectly safe. Nobody touches them. In North America, I don't know anybody who would like, yeah, I'll just park my stroller in the middle of the street. And
that's unfortunate.
yeah, again, it's too bad we have to think about these things.
Right.
Another mistake is thinking about weather. I mentioned that, I live somewhere cold and wet. So this sort of ties a little bit into when we talk about design atmosphere and aesthetics is what materials you put where. But remember that if it's wet or slippery, guests are going to fall down. If they're wearing heels, I don't know if any of your listeners are familiar with walking in heels on a wet floor is extremely challenging. And yet a lot of restaurants will have a tile entryway because they think it's easier for them. They're like, oh, well, it's easier to mop because people come in with wet. Well, yeah, it's easier to mop, but it's really tough on your guests. So I'm always thinking about, where is this restaurant? Where is the doorway? How are people getting in? What will they have with them? What are they wearing? What are they carrying? Can I make that entry experience both as appealing, but also as safe as possible? I also want to control how much money I'm spending on utilities. So this idea of just a door that opens to the outside, without any kind of vestibule or separation between a dining space and the outside, other than that single door, I'm going to end up sending all this air that I've either heated or cooled right into the outside. And all that hot and or cold air from outside is going to flow right through to where people are seated. So I think hard about, where's that entrance, and do I need a set of double doors or two doors so that there isn't that blast of air going one way or the other, and I'm keeping the air that I've spent money on, that I've heated or cooled, inside my restaurant and not going out into the street.
Great stuff. All awesome advice. I think that's the last thing I see. Actually, no, there's one more bullet here we have not covered. That is not thinking about sight lines, but I think you already talked about that. Did you not?
I did. I wanted to finish with it because
Important,
it's
huh?
so important. I want to hammer it because this is such a common problem. People like booths. We know this. And in our next session, we're going to talk a lot about booths and why they're so awesome. But there's one problem with booths, is that they have high sides. And there is a standard height beyond which you should never go. And I will not tell you that height until next time. But what I will tell you is, some designers violate that height of the back of a booth. And if they do, your servers can't see what's happening at that table, and the people at that table can't make eye contact with their server.
Right.
And part of what we try to do when we design a restaurant is make sure that guests can see the things that we want them to buy, like the back bar. So I never position seats so that guests can't see the bar by design. And the illustration that I'm showing along with this is a restaurant with high-backed booths with additional glass separations above the backs of the booth, and everything is facing away from the bar. This is like, don't do this. You're actually hamstringing yourself if you want to make money.
Yeah,
Looks nice.
there's so many little details and things to consider, and you have years of experience doing this, and I cannot wait to dive into our next workshop where we unpackage teaser, how should you lay out seating to get the results you want. And I think booths are gonna be a big part of that conversation. This has been a lot of fun. I'm not cutting you short though, am I? Do you have more to share?
No, I mean, and those were the points I really wanted to get to. As I said, we could talk all day. And I'm sure many people listening have examples in their own mind of like, oh, I've seen a restaurant that violated some of these rules, or I've seen things that were fantastic that I would like to share. So by all means, if there's a way for you to provide comments to Eric, I know he'd love to hear them. And maybe when you join us at the next workshop, we can talk about some of the things you've seen.
Yes, and we do want to open it up for Q&A. Before we do that, just a more broad Q&A before we cut for that. This is a question I'm just curious about. We covered a lot of traditional, like full service and QSR and fast casual. There seems to be, with the ever rising costs of goods going up and labor costs going up, new business models where it's more of like a counter casual, like where you're seeing more of these concepts that aren't really QSR type food or even fast casual type food. It's like full service quality food, but it's counter service, and it's like this giant queue, right? And everything's counter service from the bar to the food, but because of the savings in with labor and the amount of throughput that delivers, you're seeing more and more of these concepts pop up.
Yeah.
How would you like? I think you know what I'm talking about. So, as I'm going here, what's coming to your mind?
Well, restaurants that have only counter seating, and they've been around a long time, right? You know, luncheonettes, you know,
Right.
that was all counter seating back in the 40s and 50s. Again, with counter seating, it's you want the guest to understand what they're supposed to do. So where you put your menu, what you do with the floor finish, what kind of seat they're sitting on. If I'm using all counter service, I probably want a seat that's connected to the floor. And you might think, oh, that doesn't sound very appealing. But the nice thing is, if I have a seat that's connected to the floor, it always looks neat, and I can control the spacing between seats, because the amount of space I allow per seat, that's very crucial to me if all I have is a counter. So, you know, whether it's a stool that's connected to the floor or some other kind of raised seat,
I
that's
don't know
going
if
to
I
be really
explained
important.
I think the concepts I'm thinking about maybe it might be like 100-seat restaurant, right? But it's counter service. So you walk up and there's maybe like a like foyer almost with like a counter 30 feet in front of you, but there might be four terminals at that counter where you can place your order. And there's just like, you know what I'm saying, where you just kind of show up and there's like a huge basically queue, like a multi-lane queue, and then you grab like your ticket, your number, and then you have your tabletop number, and they deliver the food, or you get a text message and your food's ready, come pick it up.
Right.
Are you seeing more and more operations like this that are trying to basically circumnavigate the server role to cut down on cost of labor?
Absolutely. And you have to design those extremely carefully, because now that you've got guests going back and forth and getting their own food, then I would allocate more space per person.
Right.
If you've got a server running food to a table, I can get a little tighter. But if guests are going up to a counter once their order's ready and they got to go get a tray or whatever it is and go back to their seat, I want bigger aisles. I want that to be a much easier experience for the guest. The person, I'm a little bit older than many of your listeners. I personally don't like a restaurant where I'm doing all the work. I'm happy if it's a fast food restaurant, you know, because but this idea that you're going to text me, I don't want to give you my phone number. I really don't.
You see more and more of them, though. I think the
I know.
next generation might be a little bit more willing to give up that information for convenience
Yeah, and I know a lot of restaurants
and
want it
cost.
because now it's a marketing opportunity. So I totally see the value in it. But what I will tell you is this: if you're designing a concept that relies 100% on a guest's device, you have a problem.
Yeah.
You need to have a backup. You need to, you know, sure, everything's on the phone, but you know what? You still have a paper menu.
Yeah.
Or there's still a way, because otherwise you may say, oh, well, you know, younger generation, they're fine with it. Why are you designing a concept that is actually turning away a chunk of people who have money? Like, why would you do that?
Good point.
So it's okay to say, yeah, we're gonna, you know, take your cell phone number and we'll text you when your food's ready. But you've got to have a plan B for guests who, for whatever reason, don't want you to do that. I'll give you an example of, I have a nephew who is 21 years old, and he has moved to a flip phone. He's like, I don't want to deal with all this stuff.
Stephanie, I am like, if I didn't need my phone to do social media, to navigate this country, to find out where I can park my car safely overnight on the side of the road in my camper. I mean, flip phones are very intriguing. Don't get me wrong. I think I can't blame your nephew. This has been a lot of fun. I do want to make sure we leave time for our attendees to ask your questions after we wrap up. So I'm going to give you your opportunity to, one, how can we connect with you if we want to talk to you more about this? And then two, I'm going to have you call somebody out.
Sure. Well, the easiest way to get in touch with me is very old school. I'm not on social media. So you can reach me by email. And my email is skr4@cornell.edu. So even though I am retired professor, I still have a cornell.edu email address. So skr4@cornell.edu. And I'm pretty good about checking my email.
You just struck a chord with me, honestly. One of the things I'm trying to do with this podcast, there are so many talented, incredibly knowledgeable professionals out there. i.e., this network of people that I've garnered over the past 11 years who've been referred to me by word of mouth because of the work they do. And it's so hard today to, find out like who do I want to work with, who's out there who I can go learn from. And I feel like it's really about just making if you're good at making noise on social media, you can project this image of being the best in the business. And I really want to help find the Stephani Robsons out there who are just good at what they do, and their work draws the business onto them, and to like make an example of people, to find those people and to collaborate with them to go deeper on these subjects. And how else would have my listeners have discovered Stephani Robson?
Well, sometimes you stumble across me because I show up on when anybody wants to talk about seating behavior during the pandemic. Seating behavior in restaurants became really, really interesting to the media. And I cannot tell you how many media podcasts and TV segments, and, suddenly it was a thing. And it was like, yay,
Mm.
suddenly people care about what I do. It's great.
So I know you have some names, some folks you've worked with that have really impressed you, and you want to make some call outs. Maybe we can do one today, and we'll save the other ones for uh, the next coming days when you come back.
Sure. Well, there's someone that I think your listeners might find really interesting, because I talked a little bit about menu placement today, and we'll talk more about that a little bit when we talk about signage in our third workshop. But what kind of menu you have, and not just what it looks like, but how you design a menu to balance your offering, your pricing, what you're doing in the kitchen. You often need someone who's a specialist in this, and I can give a shout out to my friend and former student, Sean Willard. Sean Willard is a menu engineer, and in fact, you can find him at menuengineering.com. But he is really knowledgeable about how you put together a menu that does what you want it to do for your operation, and from everything from what's on that menu to what the menu looks like. So there's and I'm very fond of him. We had lots of fun when he was my student, and we still keep in touch. So if you're looking for someone to help you with the menu, he's a really great person to talk to.
We just found our next workshop.
Yeah, yeah.
Sean, I'm coming after you.
And he's got a great radio voice too.
Perfect. And we have your contact information. And this was recorded live at Restaurant Unstoppable Network. This is the new normal. Once a week, we're going to be taking a workshop from the network, and we're going to be posting it to the podcast. If you want to join us for these live events, be sure to find the link below this audio or this video. We'll link to the network where you can join. And when you join this community, Restaurant Unstoppable Network, you're supporting our mission to do honest work, to find people, to use word of mouth to steer the ship of the podcast. And this is all how it happens. You guys support the show by joining these conversations. And we're going to break now for Q&A, where you would be able to ask your questions about today's workshop directly to Stephani if you joined. And thank you so much, Stephani. We're going to say goodbye now, but we're going to open it up for Q&A.
My pleasure. Great to be here, Eric. Thanks.
Thank you. Cheers.